And so our monthly theme is playing with paradox in October. And today's talk title is the paradox mindset. I'm glad you already got started on figuring out what the definition of a paradox is. But here's another definition for you. A paradox is a statement, proposition, or situation that appears to be contradictory, self-defeating, or absurd, but may possess an underlying truth or a meaningful resolution. In other words, a paradox involves elements that seem incompatible or logically inconsistent. A paradox creates a puzzle or a challenge to our conventional thinking. And Brené Brown defines paradox as the appearance of contradiction between two related components. I think that's pretty much what Stephen was sharing. So I'm going to give an example of a paradox. Let's call it the grandmother paradox. If you were to travel back in time and prevent your grandmother from meeting your grandfather, it creates a paradox. Because if your grandparents never met, you wouldn't be born, so how could you go back in time to prevent their meeting? Right? Paradoxes often prompt us to think more deeply about the nature of the concepts involved and can lead us to insights that transcend apparent contradictions. They are commonly used in philosophy, literature, science, and everyday language to provoke more deep thought, stimulate discussion, or highlight the limitations of our understanding. Here's another example of a paradox, and this one plays with the concepts of truth and falsehoods. It's called the liar paradox. So there's this person in the town where you live who is known as the town liar. Everyone knows this person always lies and that you can't believe anything they say. Imagine one day this person comes up to you and says these words: "This statement is false." Well, since you know the person always lies, then the statement is false must be true. But if it's true, that means this statement is false. Do you get the paradox? It really kind of like twists our mind. It's hard to wrap our mind around these two things that are so different. So paradoxes force us to question our assumptions and conventional wisdom, encouraging us to examine the concepts more deeply. They often arise in situations where two seemingly incompatible ideas coexist, showing us the situation is actually complex. Resolving a paradox often requires us to use creative thinking to see beyond apparent contradictions to find the deeper truth. Yesterday, one of my dearest friends treated us to a day soak at what is the most beautiful hot springs I've ever been to. It's my favorite one. It's Breitenbush Hot Springs. Perhaps some of you may have been there. It's located between Salem, Oregon, and Bend. It's a healing retreat in the National Forest on the side of Mount Jefferson. And as we were driving, all of a sudden, right in the front of our view was, oh my gosh, this beautiful mountain, and it had a whole bunch of snow on it, and it was Mount Jefferson. And it was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. It was just gorgeous. Couldn't have been a better day. But the hot springs have been a meeting place for multiple tribes over the past 10,000 years. I hadn't been there in a few years, and the reason why is this, which I found on their website. On September 7th, 2020, the community of people at Breitenbush were forced to evacuate because of a fire. On September 8th, the Lion's Head fire reached their grounds. Many thousands of forested acres are burnt, with hundreds of trees down and stacked at the sides of the roads. Near the Breitenbush property, there were 71 summer cabins on public lands in the forest. All but one burnt down, along with thousands of trees. Breitenbush was, of course, forced to close. They were dealing with all the impacted electrical and other utility lines, and they were removing ash and debris from 60 burned down buildings. They were also taking down fire-damaged trees that could soon fall because the fire burned their roots to death. Obviously, the fire was devastating, and yet here's the paradox, and the science is indisputable. Forest fires are a natural and necessary part of our ecosystem. Although often harmful and destructive, wildfires play an important role in nature. And I'm sure if you're living in California, you're probably familiar with these facts. When a fire reduces dead or decaying matter to ashes, nutrients return to the soil instead of remaining captive in old vegetation. Fire also acts as a disinfectant, removing disease-ridden plants and harmful insects from the forest ecosystem. When fires burn up plant debris and trees, they make way for young, healthy trees and vegetations to thrive. On our drive to the hot springs, for many, many miles throughout, we were seeing burnt forest on either side of the windy, narrow highway. It was shocking to see so much destruction. But since it had been a few years since the fire, we were also able to see the new growth that was part of the forest healing process and resilience. There were beautiful wildflowers in bloom, and short green shrubs were returning. There were some trees that were still alive, like the dogwoods, whose leaves were beginning to turn red now that the winter is turning colder. It was so beautiful. The red stood out against the black, burnt bark of the standing trees and the white, stark poles of the dead trees, whose bark had been totally burnt off, reminded me of bones. Because the habitats for plants, birds, and animals are significantly altered by fire, the first few years following a forest fire brings a great diversity of species. The ultimate outcome of fire in the forest is creation of what can be called a mosaic effect, with a variety of habitats and different aged trees, making the forest more healthy and resilient. The people at Breitenbush had to take a close look at how they wanted to support the healing of the forest. There was no consensus between those residents of Breitenbush who live in the forest and the U.S. Forest Service personnel who are managing the post-fire burnt areas that surround Breitenbush. So after considering their options and studying the effects of fire on the environment, the conclusion the Breitenbush community came to is that given the science that forest fires are inevitable and even have positive benefits in the ecosystem, they decided to do some of what the U.S. Forestry was doing by removing any burnt trees that could cause harm by falling. They decided against any post-fire logging, and they would leave fire-affected trees standing where it was safe to do so, and oppose any plans to set up salvage logging sales in those recently burned areas. Post-fire logging does not create more resilience in forests, it actually causes the opposite. So the folks at Breitenbush support the idea that nature knows best and that leaving the environment alone to do its thing and heal in its own ways over time makes the best sense. They believe the forest is a magical place. Life force is ancient and powerful there, and it will prevail. Understood correctly, forest fires are not disasters. They lead inevitably to regeneration and rebirth. So we find paradoxes everywhere in our world. You may have heard these sayings. You have to spend money to make money. If you don't risk anything, you risk everything, or less is more. The paradox mindset is the ability to hold and consider two seemingly opposed ideas at the same time. We tend to believe that being pulled in opposite directions will cause us stress, but studies have shown that when we can embrace this tension and step into paradoxical thinking, people are more creative, flexible, and productive. Jim Collins, in his book B 2.0, where the letters B and E stand for Beyond Entrepreneurship, writes, quote, "Builders of greatness are comfortable with paradox. They don't oppress themselves with the tyranny of the or, which pushes people to believe that things must be either A or B, but not both. Instead, they liberate themselves with the genius of the and. So the paradox mindset can set us free from black and white thinking. To truly develop a paradox mindset, we must encourage ourselves to step out of our comfort zones. We need to look at situations from a curiosity perspective and embrace our vulnerability by stepping into uncomfortableness where differing ideas collide and sometimes merge. When we do this, the uncomfortable space outside our comfort zone can become fertile ground for our imaginations to sprout new, innovative ideas that can grow into solutions for the challenges in our world today. Just like what happens in the forest after a fire. New growth spurts and the forest becomes healthier. We as a society can become healthier too. So I'm going to invite you to consider this way of thinking. Imagine that the opposite of an absolute truth is not a falsehood, but another absolute truth. This way of thinking is a profound shift from black and white thinking. It means that truth isn't confined to a single path. There isn't only one way. Truth can be found in all perspectives and ideas that may even seem contradictory. I've noticed in our world today, it seems that there continues to be more and more need for a greater understanding of how to support those of us who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. We don't all agree on the best avenues for support. I've had the honor of being with folks who were experiencing different realities other than the reality that society deems as normal, like the current one we're having right now. The paradox is that even though they may not be able to function very well in our everyday reality, they may be more attuned to a particular channel of the one mind that we are. For instance, they may have been found walking down the street saying they have an important message and they need to talk to the president. By doing so, they ended up being put in a psychiatric hospital, like someone I know, who years later would be working in a position to influence legislation around mental health in Washington, D.C. A question we could ask ourselves is this: are we drugging our prophets? If you are familiar with stories about the prophets in the Bible, in our society today, many of them would probably be put in a psychiatric facility because what they were saying seemed to be so outrageous and making no sense at the time. Us humans can be frightened by things we don't understand. But who am I to say that my understanding of what normal reality is the only kind of reality a person should be having? Some indigenous tribes consider those who experience altered states of reality their shamans. They see them being in touch with reality outside of the norm and go to them to find answers to important questions for the tribe. We can use paradox as a tool to bridge divides, foster inclusivity, and help create a world that works for everyone. The essence of playing with paradox out loud is about taking the wisdom we gain from our own internal explorations and applying it to the external challenges we are facing in society today. It's like weaving the threads of seemingly opposing ideas into a tapestry of new understanding and progress. In conclusion, in order to do our part in creating a world that works for everyone, let us choose to be the builders of greatness by breaking loose of the constraints of either-or thinking and open to our creative genius by embracing both and. As Neil Bohr stated, it is the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth. There is really no one right way to look at anything. So I invite us to open ourselves up to hold many ideas and perspectives at once. A paradox mindset is the key that unlocks the door to deepening our spiritual understanding of the world. So I'll leave you with that to ponder and contemplate and think about throughout this week. Thank you.